Hello, I'm Rob Sloman. I'm the director of a movie called Everton, Howard's Way, which came out in November of last year. It's about the Everton team of the 80s, a team that I felt didn't really get enough credit, certainly not since the inception of Sky in 1992. Team hasn't received a lot of credit since then and doesn't get talked about. And I thought it was about time that we changed that. So, having been an Everton fan for 45 or so years, I thought we'd try and do something about it. So, I'm here tonight to answer any questions. Hopefully, it's a Q&A. Otherwise, it's just me talking. And I'd prefer it if some people joined in. So hopefully we'll have a few of you that can ask some questions about Howard's Way, the film, and I'll be here for however long there are people talking, and hopefully we can answer a few questions that you might have. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm Cornish. I've got nothing to do with the area of Liverpool, really. I was born in Cornwall, farmer's son. And my first Everton hero was Bob Latchford. So I think 75, 76 is when I started supporting Everton. We weren't any good, but Bob was my first hero. And I spent a lot of time as a kid drawing pictures and forecasting scores for Everton games, and that first team of the 70s was the sort of latter part of the 70s was my first team that I followed, with Dobson and Latchford and Mackenzie and Dave Thomas and Andy King, Mike Lyons, who's a part of this film. So that was how it all started. And then I really was the only Everton fan at school. I used to listen to the Liverpool and Nottingham Forest fans running around the playground talking about all their various successes. There was only me as an Evertonian, and I had to wait until I was about 15 before we became any good. So all that time, just people running around the playground bragging about trophies. Well, I didn't know any of that, and then suddenly in the mid 80s, we became quite good. So I've got a couple of questions. Martin Day, is it Martin Day? Well, Martin, anyway. Why was Kevin Ratcliffe not in the film? Well, he was in the film. I think you mean why wasn't he at St George's Hall? Kevin just couldn't make it on the day. I hoped he would get there, but for his own reasons, he wasn't able to get there on the night, which was a shame. Adrian Heath also couldn't make it over. Adrian obviously is a manager of Minnesota in America, and their transfer window coincided with the showing at St George's Hall. I would have loved Adrian to be in there. He's very, very popular with the rest of the team. He's a brilliant interview in the film. But yeah, he tried right up until I think the last couple of days to get there and just couldn't, unfortunately. So that was sad, because I think all of the players were really looking forward to seeing Adrian. I think as much for the after party as anything else. So next question from Alan Barnes. How did you manage to arrange so many interviews, and who could you not get hold of, or who said no? Well, we got everybody, really. We didn't get everybody. The one person that I tried to get that said no, and only one person said no, and that was Glenn Keeley, who probably knew that he didn't have a big part in the film and that his part of the film would be 20 minutes in that one game. He only played one game for Everton and got sent off in the 5-0 game. So I asked Glenn. He was very polite, and he said he'd prefer not to do it, and I understood that. But all the players, everybody was happy to do it. I got to Andy Gray first. I've known Andy a little bit for a number of years. I was at Sky in the very, very early days and knew Andy a little bit. And so I got in touch with Andy and said, I'd like to make this film, but I need all the players. I want to do everybody. I've seen, I don't know if anybody's seen the film I Believe in Miracles about Nottingham Forest, but they had everybody. And I thought, well, why can't we do the same? Obviously, Howard's not around, but I thought we could maybe get to all the players, Colin Harvey as well. So Andy helped me get to Peter Reid and to Graham Sharp, and then Peter Reid's just got a number for everybody. And so once I got to Peter, then it became a lot easier. And I went around meeting them one by one because I wanted to explain what we were going to do, for two reasons, really. If I'd have just turned up and done the interviews, they don't know me, they don't know what the plan is, and I probably wouldn't have got much out of them. So I wanted to meet them all and make sure that they were comfortable and confident with what we were trying to do. And I knew that if they thought that Andy was on board and Peter was on board and Graham Sharp was on board, that they'd probably be happier to do it. So yeah, just phoned them, emailed them, and then went to meet them, and they were all lovely. They all wanted to do it. So so that was. So I did that in sort of 2017, early part of 2018. I met everybody, and then panicked because it looked like the film might not happen. So yeah, they all wanted to do it. Nobody asked for money, which was just as well because we didn't really have any. But they were all brilliant, and wanted to get involved, and that made it a lot easier. Some of them were trickier to get hold of than others. Adrian's obviously out in Minnesota, but Peter had numbers for everybody. I got wrong numbers for Alan Harper and for Kevin Richardson initially. So I was having chats with the wrong Alan Harper, the wrong Kevin Richardson, but we finally got them, sorted those guys out. And the only guy I didn't meet other than Adrian in person was Gary Stevens, because obviously Gary's in Perth in Australia. So that would have been tricky, but everybody else we caught up beforehand so that they all knew what they were doing. Martin, yeah, same age, yeah. Latchford, Mackenzie, Dobson, good team, wasn't it? Good team, but didn't win anything. So I remember they went top of the league a couple of times. I think we beat Bristol City in the snow. Is that right? 4-1. I remember listening to that on radio somewhere, and I think we went top of the league, but because of our undersoil heating, I think we played 3 more games than anybody else or something, and eventually Liverpool and a couple of others came past us. But yeah, that 70s team, could probably name it, was my first memories, and Bob was the hero. Never met Bob, never met him, and played with the idea of getting him in this film, maybe in the Mike Lyons role, if you've seen. But Mike was sort of Mr. Everton, wasn't he? And a bit like Chelsea's John Terry. Well, he was our Everton version of John Terry, except for the fact that we didn't win anything. But Mike is a lovely fella, and yeah, it's a shame we couldn't win anything for the likes of him and one or two others that were with Everton a long time in those days. I always felt we were a goalkeeper. We needed a better goalkeeper, and maybe another centre half. And if we'd have had those two, I think the rest of the team with Dobson and King and Latchford and Thomas and Mackenzie and Rioch for a period of time were good enough to have won something. So if I scroll down here, I don't know if there's more questions. Oh, there we go. Bobby Mims. Well, Bobby Mims, I stopped the film in terms of the editorial. I felt like the story that I wanted to do was sort of 84-5 was the end of that story. Andy leaving, if you like, was the end of that story. And obviously Neville got injured in I think about March of 85, and Bobby Mims came in. But I didn't really dwell on 86 because obviously in 86 we didn't win anything. We were very close, but I felt like to go on about 85-6 meant that I had to talk more about Liverpool, because obviously they denied us a trophy that year. So same reason for 87 is a bit different. I just felt that editorially the story I wanted to do was about the team coming from nowhere to becoming the best in the world. So there is a story. I think 87 is a different story because there were a lot of players injured. Bracewell, Mountfield, Reedy was injured a bit, I think, that season at one point. Andy's gone, so it's a different team, a different story. And you know, if someone wants to chuck a load of money at it, I'd happily make the story of that title-winning team. But for what I was trying to do, I felt that the story was stronger for focusing on a shorter period of time. I think a lot of films do that with documentaries, where you sort of do a smaller period of time to be able to do it properly. And if you go on to 86.7, the archive, I'd have to bought more archive, and we didn't have the money. So the further I went with the story, the longer I went with the story, I felt like the weaker it would become, even though obviously that 86.7 team was fantastic, because there were so many injuries that Howard had to contend with, and we still won the title. Peter Barnacle, is it likely to put on Netflix? Well, actually, Sky Atlantic have bought it, and I think April, May time, Sky Atlantic, Sky Sports will be broadcasting the film. I don't know the exact dates about that. So that's where people will be able to see it on TV, Sky Atlantic and Sky Sports, from about April onwards. I think that's when it'll be there. So not Netflix, but obviously at the moment you can buy it. You can download it from Amazon Prime. You can download it from Virgin and iTunes and Sky Store, and you can buy the DVD from a number of places, including Amazon and HMV. Can you get the extras on iTunes? No, you can only get them on the DVD, as I understand it. I'm not terribly technical, but I think the DVD is the only place you'll get the extras, and they're good. They're worth getting the DVD. There's a half an hour of us battering Manchester United 5-0. I'd never seen long highlights of that game, and I think the players, Adrian Heath and a couple of others, said it could have been 8 or 9, and it could, if you watch the highlights of that game, about 32-3 minutes of that game, and an interview with Jimmy Martin, who was the coach driver back then, who's now the kit man, a real character, Jimmy. So we've got a long interview with Jimmy Martin that didn't quite seem to fit in the film, so we didn't put it in the end. There's some lovely stories. He's got some great stories. He's known all the players for, coming through since the 80s, since Howard's time, since actually Gordon Lee's time. He was there with Gordon Lee. So he's got some fabulous stories. So he's on the extras. All of his whole interview is there. Talks about Peter Reid and Pat and Andy and everybody, Neville. So that's lovely stuff. And he was the coach driver at Wembley, obviously, in '84, when people are banging on the side of the bus. One of my favourite bits of the film. And Peter's mentioned here that Andy Gray's letter to the Echo, when Andy left, he left after the players had all said cheerio for the summer. So Andy didn't get a chance to say goodbye to anyone. And so he wrote a letter to the Liverpool Echo, and I'm trying to remember, Ken Rogers. Ken Rogers was the sports editor then, before the days of Dave Prentice. So he wrote a letter to Ken, which Ken then printed in the paper, basically saying thank you to all the Everton fans who'd been so amazing, and also thanks to the players. So he wrote that letter, and I just got him to read it out. I got hold of the letter, and I got him to read it, and it is really nice. It was in the film until very late on, but we had to chop a good 30 or 40 minutes out of the first version that we finished with. So Andy's letter came out, but it's on the extras, and it's good. Brought a tear to your eye, did it, Peter? Yeah, it's good. Yeah, Andy. I mean, Andy was very emotional in that interview. You probably see when he talks about leaving. He teared up, and I've known him a while. I don't know him that well, but I've known him a long time, and I've never seen him get emotional like that before. And he was properly emotional there. Keith Mullin, where did you meet Hollywood Dave Feely? So Dave was really important to the film. I don't know how many of you know David Feely, El Cab, on Twitter, but when I thought I had a chance of putting the film together, I wanted to get the fans involved. I feel, and I still feel, like Everton fans are very, very important to the club. Maybe are closer to the football club than any other, certainly Premier League team. But if you see where Goodison is, and it's very much a part of the community, and I think it's retained that. Still feels like a community club. Maybe not in 5 years' time with all the money that's getting ploughed in, but I wanted to get the fans involved. I saw him at the West Ham Cup game when we lost about 36-35 on penalties a few years ago. I saw him there. I'd been talking to him on Twitter anyway, but not about the film. But I saw him at that West Ham game, and I mentioned to him that I'd like to make this film. At that point, it was a long way off, but I was keen to do it. A lot of things had to happen before we got to do it, but I saw him at that game, told him, I'm coming back to you if and when. And then when we finally got the go ahead, I got hold of him and said, let's meet up. I need to talk to you. I want you involved. And I came up to Liverpool, and we met in the Marriott in Liverpool. I met everybody in the Marriott in Liverpool, and we had a good chat. He introduced me to Keith Mullin, who thank God for Keith Mullin, who was responsible for 95% of the music on the film. The brilliant Keith Mullin. So Dave and Keith are very good friends. They sit together when they watch the match. Keith with his earplugs in, because Dave doesn't often stop talking. I think he stopped talking in the late 80s for a while. But anyway, so Keith and he became very important to the film. Keith was my musical advisor. He saw my list of tracks that I thought might work in the film and said, yeah, you probably better leave it with me. And I did, and I was glad that I did. And then Keith wrote a lot of the original music for the film, which you will probably have heard, including the track over the end credits, Everton Forever. So Keith, couldn't have done it without Keith Mullin or David Feely. Both of them hugely talented in their own right. And also Dave Feely introduced me to Karina Duffy, who heads up Everton in the Community, which is an award-winning community charity at Everton. And it's no wonder they win awards with people like Karina involved. She works tirelessly for that club, doing amazing stuff, raising a load of money. And Karina got me access to the ground and got me access to the right people at the club, just to tell them. Everton weren't heavily involved in the making of the film, but I wanted them to know that we were making the film, so that they supported us whenever needed, and they've done that. They've been brilliant. But Karina was fantastic. What else have we got here? Andy Gray's letter. Alan Irvine. Well, that's a good point. Didn't go to Alan. Felt like when we got to that year, that season, 84-5, he wasn't part of it. I saw a squad picture that I think someone called Crawford Miles put up the other day, and Alan was in it, and so was Terry Curran. So I think Terry Curran would have been an interesting one to go to, because he is the player that when we beat Southampton in the FA Cup semi-final, Terry's the unfortunate guy who was nearest to the ball when the final whistle blew, and he was right in that corner where the Everton fans, thousands of them, came on. Terry might have been an interesting shout, mightn't he? But I focused really on the 14 or 15 players that provided the bulk of the squad for that season. And like I say, I mean, there wasn't really a Terry Curran moment or an Alan Irvine moment. The way that we put the film together, I wanted to have something for everybody. So when we meet them, there's a reason to meet them at that point in the film, if that makes sense. So we meet Neville early on because although Graham Sharp and Kevin Ratcliffe were already at the club, Neville's driving into the city at the time that the film is sort of getting going. And then we try and do that with everybody. There's a reason Gary Stevens comes in after the 5-0 hammering, as does Derek. Kevin Ratcliffe is still trying to find his place in that team. And also misses that 5-0 game, but then is back in after it. Peter came to the club and was injured for a long period of time, but then he gets going at the same time that Andy Gray comes in. Colin Harvey becomes the first team coach. He was in charge of the reserves before that. So everybody comes in when it feels that Trevor was at the club for a long time before I introduce him in the film, because I wanted to bring them in when there was a reason to bring them in, if that makes sense. So Adrian Heath comes in when Graham Sharp is talking about Adrian getting a hard time off the fans. And then Pat and Paul are obviously the last two, Paul Bracewell and Pat Van den Hauwe, the last two that we introduced because they weren't there until that 84-5 season. Gary Thomas, have you still got loads of... Gary Thomas, have you still got loads of unseen footage to share? I've noticed you've shared extra stuff that's not in the film. Another 40 hours worth, probably, more than that. I'm going to keep doing that. So keep looking out for the Howard's Way film site on Twitter, page on Twitter. I'll just keep loading. Got loads of stuff. Got some really funny stories that were maybe too long to get in the film. Actually, I was making notes of a couple of them earlier today that I need to make sure I get in the film, and those will pop up as the days and weeks go past. I'll keep doing that. So loads and loads, Gary, to put up online. I would say a couple of years worth of clips to come. How many times did Jamie Yates try and get in the film, says Christopher Bailey. Jimmy lovely about the film, but I didn't meet him until, I don't think I met Jamie until St George's Hall. So he didn't try and get in the film. One or two did. I know I could name a few names of people that were trying to get in, but everybody, Everton's a really strong community club, and even the guys that weren't in the film tried to help me with it. And as soon as it felt like as soon as I said I was making a film about Everton, everybody was super supportive and said, right, okay, I'll open this door, I'll help with this. There are some, like Crawford Miles and Mark Nixon, I'll name those two guys, were brilliant. Really helpful with pictures and an archive that I didn't really know too much about. Crawford's got everything. So I was then able to go to the Beeb and to ITV and say, look, I know this exists. Have you still got it? Or I know it existed. Have you still got it? So Crawford and Mark were brilliant and both incredibly supportive. They're both on the film. Crawford shakes hands, I thought, does a high five with Peter Reid when he comes in to the film, and Mark Nixon almost does a high five with Peter Reid. Sorry, Mark, but that's quite funny. If you spot it, Mark gets left hanging by Peter Reid as Peter Reid comes in on that evening with Peter, Graham, and Andy. Anne Williams, glad you found us, Anne. You don't sound like a Scouser, so presumably you moved away. No, I didn't move away. I was Cornish. I'm Cornish. I am Cornish. And I have no real understanding of why I support Everton other than Bob Latchford became my hero when I was a kid, and once you've made that choice, you never change, do you? So yeah, I was a farmer's son down in Cornwall, and there wasn't a match or a moment or anything that I can remember that triggered it, but like I say, you make that choice and then you stick with it. I remember my mum gave me a shirt with the Everton badge steamed on it. It's just a blue t-shirt, but she'd steamed the Everton badge on the chest and put a number 6 on the back. So that would have been Christmas '75, I think. And yeah, so I've never lived in Liverpool. I now live in Surrey. I go up as much as I can. I've got a couple of small lads, so I can't go up too often because somebody in the house would be happy if I kept disappearing. But I'm up for the Newcastle game tomorrow. So I try and get up there when I can, and I love the city. I absolutely love being up there. It does now feel like a very much a second home. I can still get hopelessly lost around there, as Dave Feely will tell you last week, trying to find a restaurant that I've been to 10 times. I couldn't find it. But I do love the place. But no, I'm not a Scouser. Pete Francis, what did the club make of the film? Have they embraced it? Yeah, they've been brilliant. Yeah, they have. I wasn't sure what they would make of it because I didn't try and make a PR film, if you like. I wanted to make the film that I wanted to make. And obviously we were rubbish in the early 80s and we did get stuffed by Liverpool, but the context, I needed that context to then show where we came from to where we went to. But the club understood that, and I filmed on the pitch quite a bit, as you'll have seen, with Kevin Sheedy, and for the Bayern Munich stuff, we were on in the ground for a long time there, Colin Harvey as well, and we did some bits and bobs at the club, and the club had a meeting there with Scott McLeod, who's head of fan engagement, I think. And Scott was brilliant right from the start, very helpful, very generous. So the club, even though they weren't actively involved in the film, were tremendously supportive and have been ever since. You can see that we used the logo, the 84.5 logo. You have to get these sort of things cleared. One sec. So when we put the film together, we wanted to be able to use little things like the logo from the time, and that was really important for us to be able to make it feel authentic. I wanted the whole film to feel authentic. That was the reason for getting fans like Dave Feely, Keith Mullin involved, and and Frank Wilmot, the windmill man. I wanted it to feel real to the fans that were going home and away in the 70s and 80s, etc. So yeah, the club the club maybe could have said, oh, there's a bit too much of the fans, and we don't get a say in how it looks, but they didn't. They were great, so really pleased with that. Could you tell Andy Gray? So Andy Gray, right? So all of the players. So Christopher Bailey. Every single player that I asked considers himself an Evertonian. So the likes of Paul Bracewell, Trevor, who played for a lot of other clubs, Gary Stevens, Harper Richardson, they all consider themselves Evertonians. And Andy Gray, I know that you see him now and he's a pundit, but if you ever get talking to him, he will say we about Everton, and that's how he feels. Even Andy with his roots at Aston Villa and before that up in Scotland. Andy Gray is an Evertonian, and he has to be neutral. And you might watch him and think, oh, well, and I know a lot of people reacted when Steven Gerrard scored a goal in the Champions League, and Andy reacted, but that's him reacting as a pundit. That's his job. But yeah, Andy Gray definitely loves Everton, and I talk to him every now and again, and his heart is blue. He's desperate for Everton to get back to the top of the game. He really is. So whatever you might think, and I've known Andy a long time, but without him, we wouldn't have been able to make this film. Not the way we've done it. Andy Gray, absolutely outstanding, and whatever you might have read or heard or thought about Andy Gray, he's a good guy, and incredibly helpful for this film. And yeah, he definitely still loves Everton. Can I play a DVD that will play in the US? Can I buy a DVD that will play in the US? I can see actors. Yeah, you can. In fact, I've got friends who've ordered the DVD. It should work, should play. So I've got friends in the US who've ordered the DVD. And I believe it plays on all regions. So let me know if it doesn't, but it should do. So then you'd be able to see the extras. Yeah. It would be great to show it on the night of the charity sleepover, Anne Williams. Yeah, it would be actually. Yeah, that's in March, isn't it? We'll talk to the club about that. I've got a couple of screenings planned, and I'll talk to Karina. We've got a couple of ideas that we thought might work, might be quite good fun. But yeah, the sleepover would be good. Don't know logistically how we'd make it work, but yeah, let's try. We've got a couple of London screenings. If anybody's on here that's based down south, we've got at least one London screening, which hopefully we'll do at the end of next month, but soonish anyway. So we're going to do a London screening. Yeah, and I'll talk to the club. That's a good idea, isn't it? Let's see what we can do with that. Pete Francis thought Colin Harvey was great in the film. I did too. Colin is so lovely. It's interesting to know what the players say about him, given that he was so soft and gentle, and it was very emotional doing that interview, because I knew obviously that at some point we were going to talk about Howard, and Colin still loves him. So that was very emotional, and very touching to do that. But if you talk to Graham Sharp and you talk to Kevin and Trevor and Neville, they will tell you how ferocious Colin Harvey was as a coach. He didn't take any nonsense. He had standards that he set when he was playing, and he didn't drop those standards as a coach. So I think in the interview he said something like Alan Ball came in and raised the bar for every one of us. And Colin will say in that modest way of his that nobody else was able to get up to the level of Alan Ball, but they all tried, and that should be therefore the level that everybody sought to achieve from that moment on. So Colin was lovely, and I believe that the club really does look after him, and why wouldn't you? He's a treasure, isn't he? And every time I go up now, I go and have a look at the statue, which sits rather magnificently there outside St Luke's. So yeah, Colin was absolutely lovely, and he's a top guy. Alan Barnes, what was it like interviewing Pat Van Zandt? He still looks a handful. So Dave Feely and Karina introduced me to Pat. Would have been sort of, I think, autumn autumn or even maybe the winter of 2017, and we went to the People's Place there to meet Pat, and he stared at me for 10 minutes, didn't really say very much, just looked at me, and I thought, oh, this could be tricky then, because I'm not sure he's buying into this. And then all of a sudden we got talking about the Bayern Munich game, and he just said that he remembered that night. And he says, when I walked out, it's like a volcano, boom. He said, and I thought, brilliant, because if he'll do that when we talk about, if he'll do that when we actually were filming, that's all I really need, for him to add those little bits. But lots of people have told me they'd never heard him talk before this film. And I spoke to the BBC journalist, Phil McNulty, who's an Everton fan, and he said that Pat van der Nouw was just famous for being elusive. No one could get to him. And when they did get him, he didn't say very much. So he was great. He was I think a few people have said, who was your favourite to interview in the film? Obviously, I knew some of them. I knew Andy. I knew Trevor a little bit. I knew Peter Reid would be great. So it was really nice to meet Graham Sharp, and he's been so helpful through the whole project. But Pat was a surprise, and Pat, I think, would be my sort of star of the film, just because I think he would rather, before we did it, I think he'd rather have had hot pokers in his eyes than do it. But he did it, bought into it. I think enjoyed it. Lots of good. So everybody told sort of their own funny stories. Pat's not trying to be funny when he talks about getting sent off against QPR, but he is funny just because of the way he talks about it. You know, the intensity that he talked about for Bayern Munich. You know, people are telling their funny stories. Neville's got his funny stories, etc. But I thought that Pat, with the way he talked about that night, brought something very different to the film. And I've met him a few times since. And the premiere of the film, he was out of the cinema more often than he was in it. He kept going out, I think, go and get a fag or something, but he kept popping out. So when he watched it at St George's Hall, I'm told that he sat there and watched the whole thing, and I hope he did, because I think he's brilliant in the film. And you know, he's a very different character, but I really liked Pat van der Nouw, and hopefully he come across well in the film. I'd like to think they all come across quite well in the film. But Pat was a nice surprise. He was good. He was good. Yeah, Anne Williams, I worked with him. He's the best. Yeah, listen, I've heard that everyone loves him to bits who works with him, and in that, I noticed in that in the video that they filmed for Everton Forever, he's serving tea to everybody, serving tea to Duncan Ferguson. So yeah, he's a very down to earth chap. I wonder what he would have been like in football of today, really. But yeah, a character. I would think his book is worth a read if you haven't read it. Well, it is worth a read. But yeah, good guy, Pat. Really enjoyed it. Dave Feely showing up. Am I going to tell the Mick Lyons story? So Dave Feely reckons that I must have told this story 50 times, very badly each time. So it's on the DVD extras. So Mike Lyons tells a story about his departure from Everton, and you know, if you see Dave Feely, anybody who knows him, El Cab, from this film, Dave Feely, he'll tell you the Mike Lyons story, because I'm sure he'll do it justice. But Mike Lyons' story of when he left to join Sheffield Wednesday is quite funny. So what have we got here? Peter Barnacle bumped into Andy in a pub in Tamworth in the August after he left. Right. Had a few pints with him. Lucky you. Well, I'm sure he told you some good stories. Don't know if this question answered. On the night of the first screening, it was suggested, this is Mark Gartland, it was suggested sending copies to all members of the first team to show them Nil Satis Nisi Optimum. Did this happen? Well, I got a request to send a couple of DVDs to the first team staff. So I know that the staff requested it. I don't know whether they watched it. So I can't answer that one really. It would be nice to think. I mean, I've offered to do a screening, and maybe that's happened anyway. But might be a fun occasion. I think there's a lot of them that would need subtitles. We've got so many internationals in the changing room now. But yeah, it would be something I'd love to do. That's for sure. David Plummer. Really enjoyed the film. With the new stadium and everything that's happening around the club, it would be great if this period of our history is documented in some way, both from the movie point of view and the Ancelotti era. Yeah, I mean, I think I would really love to do more with the club as well at some point. Maybe I think it's common practice now, isn't it, to do the major series for Amazon and Netflix, Man City and Sunderland. Sunderland's a bit different to the Manchester City film, isn't it? But Tottenham are doing one at the moment. It'd be interesting to see whether Everton would want to go down that road. Liverpool did one a few years ago, didn't they? So it would be good to do something that moves us forward. A few people have said that that it would be nice not to have to focus on the 1980s to reflect upon glory, and that's just the way of it. Obviously, we had 95 as well, but it would be nice if we could do something that was more up to date. So maybe we'll look to do something in the future. It'd be very different to this one. Maybe a behind the scenes, which would be pretty cool. Dave Feely, you'll be glad to know that Mark Gartland thinks you're a great guy. So there you go. If anybody else we've sort of run out of questions now, I think. If anybody's got any more questions, let me know. I'll probably go on Twitter for a short time after this. So if anybody wants to have a chat on there, we'll do that. I have got one or two other things. There's a couple more questions there, but I think we've answered them. Yeah. So Paul, there were several players that it was very important to get them into the film who weren't necessarily going to be the main interviews of the film. So Kevin Sheedy, for instance, Kevin was my favourite player in the 80s. I just thought, and Neville Southall says it in the film that we could miss anybody from that team apart from Kevin. Neville Southall says that Kevin Sheedy was the Maradona or the Messi of that team, and I wanted to make sure, because Kevin's quite quietly spoken, apparently until he's had a drink or two, but Kevin is quite quiet compared to one or two in that team, and I was very anxious to get a proper bit of Kevin Sheedy in that film. So I asked him if he would try and recreate his free kick, his twice taken free kick against Ipswich, and he said he would. And so we got access to Goodison through Karina Duffy, obviously, and Kevin shows up, and we're on the pitch. And I suggested to Kevin that he might like to have a stretch or a warm-up because, he was injury prone in the day, but I didn't want to be responsible for him getting injured that day. But Kevin assured me he was fine. So I then went to check the cameras, just brief the guys as to what we were going to try and do. Kevin warmed up by taking a couple of free kicks and then comes over to me to say that he's ripped his groin. And I thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. So he had damaged his groin. He said that he had a bruise come up took over the whole of the top of his leg after we finished filming. But ever the pro, he put a ball down and put it into the top corner, and then told us the story of Peter Reid coming over and him telling Peter Reid to clear off, not in those words, and then bent the next one into the bottom corner, and that was all one take. And just as well, because I don't think he'd have been able to kick another ball that day. Kevin was. It was nice to do that with Kevin. The guys like Alan Harper. I was asked earlier whether we've got loads more footage to show on Twitter and here on Facebook and Instagram, etc. And we have. And Alan Harper goes through the old Panini books. I've got it here somewhere, but. The Panini Everton 84-85 squad, Alan sort of walks through looking at the hairstyles, etc. And we've got everybody's there's lots more of everybody. Even Peter and Andy, who are in the film, and Graham, who are in the film a lot, have some fabulous stories and I won't tell them now because I want to put them online and people find them out for the first time. But those guys were a huge part of what we did with the film. But Derek Mountfield in his loft. I mean, Derek was up there for about 2 hours, I think, with us, just getting stuff and having to film it twice because we only had one camera, so we had to film all this tight stuff when you can see what he's actually holding up, and then we have to go and then film the wider stuff, so you change the lens on the camera, and we're up in this teeny loft for a couple of hours, and Derek didn't moan at all. So all of them really. Neville, whose first question was how much can I swear, and I said I'd prefer it if you didn't, but if it's infrequent, then we're fine. And I don't think Neville heard a word of it and just swore the entire time. But we managed to get enough out of his interview. Gary Stevens was brilliant over in Perth, and just in time for Pat van der Nou. Jonathan Denby, going back to Pat van der Nou, did he offer any more off camera as to why he wouldn't talk about Heysel? Not really. And Pat. When Pat says no, even now, when Pat says no, that's enough. I did push it. I did ask him a couple of times, as and we had talked about it beforehand. I asked Pat who he thought were, as well as Heysel, I'd asked him who he thought were the key players at that time, and he told me who he thought it was. And so then I asked him on camera, and he said everybody. And I said, yeah, but were there anyone? Because he told me off camera that there were, and I'm not going to say him because he didn't, but he said a couple of people that he thought were really important. And I said, elaborate. And he said, everybody. and just then stared at me. So we dropped that one and we moved on. Pat, yeah, I could imagine that stare could intimidate a few, and certainly would have done on the pitch, wouldn't it? Alan Barnes, John Bailey seemed sad. How is his relationship with the rest of the team? Well, John Bailey will feature in a couple of the clips that I'll be putting up in the next week or two. I don't think he's sad at all. He had a great time when we introduced John. It's at that dinner or that evening with Graham and Andy and Peter Reid on the stage, and he was just there. He was just there for a social. He wasn't supposed to go up on stage, but Peter Reid got him up on stage. Before that, backstage, he'd had a lovely time with Andy in particular and the guys. And when he went up onto the stage, he basically talked for 30 minutes, and the other three couldn't get the microphones off him. And the stories that he told, I can't put those on. I can't put those anywhere. The guys that were there that night will be able to tell people those stories. There were a lot of Everton fans, a couple of hundred in the building that night. But the stories that John Bailey told on stage have to stay in that room, I'm afraid, unless you go and see John Bailey do a talk, and I'm sure those stories will come out again. But all the players were desperate to get the microphone off of John Bailey before he embarrassed them, but they couldn't, and he did. And there's a couple more stories that have been told about John Bailey that I probably won't see Twitter either. No, he's not sad. He's if you get him on stage, if you get him in his element, he's got more stories than anybody, and he's completely prepared to tell them as well. A lot of people do some internal editing before they tell a story. Well, he doesn't have that filter, John Bailey. He just tells the stories as he remembers it. And those guys that were on stage that night might have been disappointed that Peter Reid invited him up because he let loose. It was very funny. Hi, Rob. From so that was Alan Barnes. Was that one? Hope that answers your question, Alan. He's certainly not a sad guy. Sam Ling. Hi, Rob. How did you track Gary Stevens down in Perth? Well, actually, Gary was one that Peter Reid didn't have a telephone number. So I just Googled him. I knew that he was a physio. I knew he was in Perth. So just took a punt on Gary Stevens physio coming up Perth, and it did. So the practice that he worked in anyway. So I got hold of the practice that he worked in and explained what we were doing. And Gary very quickly got back in touch, and it sort of went from there. I think I said to him in about November of 2017, I said, I think I'll be there in April of in 2018. So I'll be there in about 3 or 4 months. And obviously he wasn't there for another year, but kept in touch with him and said we'd be there as soon as possible. And when we finally got the chance to do it, we went there. And Mike Lyons lives about an hour apart from Gary, so that was quite handy. So it wasn't like I had to go over to Melbourne, fly for 5 hours to get to Perth, and do with all the logistics that would have involved. So and Gary was lovely, really, and he doesn't look any older, does he? He still looks like he could play, Gary Stevens, and Gary was great. And he came over for, I think, for a family wedding, his son's wedding, I think in August. And despite the fact that he'd been over then for a week, still came back again for a few days in November and did the screening at Fact, and then stuck around for the St George's Hall, and it was brilliant. He was top. They were all top guys, but Gary to come from Perth twice in that short space of time and come back for those screenings was great. Was great. Andrew Green, will you make another one? Yeah. Well, the problem, I would love to. Obviously, it was very much a passion project, this one, and another one would be the same. But it's very difficult to get the finance. We were lucky this time because initially I was talking to Universal, who seemed very keen. For one reason or another, it didn't happen with Universal in the end. They everything's commercial. If they don't think they can make money, they won't do it. Initially, they thought they would, and then they thought they couldn't. So they didn't do it, and then I'm left trying to find private investors. We found one, Phil Brown, and Phil, from the minute that he got in touch, the night that Millwall beat us in the FA Cup last year, he got in touch, and from that minute he gave me a sort of confidence that we'd be able to do it. As a few people know, the other investment came in the end from myself and my wife. We sat down and decided that we would do it. And it might be 10 years before we get close to getting our money back, and maybe we never will, but I don't regret it. We don't regret it because the film's been really well received, and it was really exciting to do it, and good fun. And I wouldn't swap the last 10 or 11 months for anything. So that's getting away a little bit from how we tracked everybody down and whether we'd make another one. But if the finance was there, yeah. But I don't think, we wouldn't be in a position to do it. So if someone wanted to make it happen, I'd love to make another one, because obviously there are other stories to be told there. But I don't think you could ever, this story can only be told once. That's why I was so fearful of making a mess of it, because if I cock it up, no one can do it again, because no one will touch it. No one will want to invest in a film that's sort of already been made, not made very well. So fortunately, it seems that this one's really well received. So yeah, happy to make one about 95 would be good fun, because you have sort of parallels there, because obviously season before it we nearly get relegated. So I mean, it's horrible. And then that with Joe Royle coming in and Duncan coming in, and the lovely stories around it. It's lovely, lots of player stories, and Gary Ablett's no longer around, but I'm sure there'd be some really good storytellers, and it would make it a decent film. But that's a long way off, and it would take, if somebody wants to come forward, then I'd happily talk to them. But it would be difficult, because it's just so expensive to make these things. Derek Sullivan, did Sheed score first time at the Park End in the film? He did, yeah, both of them. He didn't belt them, but he definitely did it first time. You would expect nothing less, would you? Keith Mullen again. Thank you, Keith. How hard was it to edit down the final version? Yeah, so that was the toughest job of the lot. So the final film is it's about 110 minutes, is it? Well, at one stage it was about 142, maybe a bit longer than that, actually. So we had to lose stuff that was very precious to me, and we couldn't have put much more archive in. We were sort of fairly close to the limit on all the archive. So ITV, BBC/Getty, so BBC Sport and the other stuff from the BBC that you see, the news and stuff like that. UEFA and Pathé. We used pretty much as much as we could of them. As a few seconds short on all of them, but it was really just losing bits of interview and stuff that I really wanted to include. Andy Gray's letter was in there till quite late. There was much more. There was a bit more on Wogan. There were lots more chats in the pub. Some funnier stories. I remember taking out a lot of Peter and Graham and Andy. And it's very sad to lose. You don't want to lose any of it. When you get there, and even if it was 2.5 hours, you think that, you know, and I'm sure that a lot of Everton fans would have been quite happy to sit there and watch 2.5 hours, but you sort of have to think. You sort of have to think of the people that maybe aren't quite as attached to the story as you might be making it, or the certain Everton fans watching it. So you need to make a film that cinemas are happy to play, or a cinema or two, as it was in our case, is happy with duration wise. Originally, I started thinking that it would be about 90 minutes, and was aware very quickly that it'd be more than that. But it felt like a decent length. It's quite long, isn't it? But it felt like it was a decent length, and about the right length, given and not focusing too long on any particular thing. Some people have said to me that it goes along too quickly in places, and that might be true. But I think the music really helps that, and we would have had to, if it goes a lot longer, I'd have needed to find 2 or 3 more bits of music, or Keith would have had to write 2 or 3 more bits of music. It felt like in the end we got it down to the right length, even though that it hurt taking a lot of stuff out. My editor, Mike Brook, who was fantastic and came at it from a neutral perspective, he was the one a lot of the time said, no, I think you need to let that go. So a lot of the time we did, and I need to pay tribute to him, because Mike was responsible for some of the little comic touches in the film that people like. When we made a bit of fun of John Bailey in the cup final with his orgasm line, you know, we found that line, but Mike was adamant that we could then go back through the interviews and find a couple of people saying what, and he was right. And then we stopped the music and start it again, and those little touches where the interplay between 2 people like Neville and Alan Harper for the wardrobe story. You know, Mike is fantastic at making or bringing out some humour where you know, previously you might have thought it might be difficult. He finds it, so that was great. I think we're done. I've just seen a message on Twitter. My phone's just flashed, and somebody said, "Are you still going?" And I was, but I think that if there's no more questions, then thank you very much for those of you that joined in this evening. Please do, if you haven't seen it, please do go get it. It's available on DVD from Amazon Prime. We were in the top 100 for all the way up to the new year. We were in the top 100 sellers on Amazon, which I'm told is pretty good for a sports title, effectively a sports title. Outselling Maradona and Busby and the Liverpool titles over that period of time anyway. So we've dropped a long way out of that top 100 now. So if you want to go and get the DVD and get us back in there, that would be nice. So the DVD available from HMV and from Amazon Prime online. So you can order it now and get it tomorrow. It's available in the club shop. I've been to St. Luke's a few times. Might do one more of those later on in the year. And obviously you can download it from Amazon, from iTunes, from Virgin, and from Sky Store as well. And go get it, because if you buy another 30,000 or so, we might get our money back. But please do. Thanks very much for joining me tonight. I was worried that nobody would come online and I'd just be sat here just talking to myself again. So thanks very much for that, and I'll pop over to Twitter if anybody wants to ask any other questions or get the links to get the DVD or the download. Then I'll be over there. But thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again soon.